cheat sheet here. Carlos Rivera. Does everybody here know Carlos? I think everybody does, don't they? I think Carlos is a retired surface warfare officer. He got his Ph.D. In history at Ohio State. You're kind of in the front lines, Carlos. You're teaching history to undergraduates in Central Ohio. Is that not true?
Yes.
Okay. Well, my respects to you in that case. This is going to be a really interesting subject today, I believe. It's has to do a little bit outside of our comfort zone. We don't talk about 19th century stuff too much, or we haven't so far. So thank you for keeping us back on track, Carlos. And we'll be talking about Japanese, I think he was lieutenant commander at the time, or lieutenant, who came to the United States and hobnobbed with US Navy personnel and came away from the experience with a lot of information, apparently. So Carlos, I'm just going to go ahead and turn it over to you at that point and let you start talking here.
All right. Can everybody hear me? My voice? Okay. First of all, a couple of things. I won't have the pretty graphics that many of you used. This is going to be a chronological drums and bugle history kind of thing. And it's based on data found in the archives and things like this. So again, for those of you who have any maritime experience, the title is a dual play on words. When you're at sea, the last thing you want to do is make contact with a vessel approaching you. So you have that maritime meaning, but also contact has an academic meaning. If you think about the Columbian Exchange, you're going to do that. And when you look for some of these things, I recommend, John Pratos's Combined Fleet Encoded or Decoded, where he talks about how Japanese naval attaches and officers would learn how to make contact individually with different things. And then you also have a recent guest was John Kuhn, who in his 2-volume series on the General Board has a lot of data on there on and how people use contact to get information from other sources. Sorry, I'm losing my voice here. A little bit on the relevance and on a short history. Good picture of Akiyama about the time he came to the United States. Everybody is probably most familiar with his work after 1901, where he helped develop the program for the Japanese Navy to win in the Yellow Sea and also at Battle of Tsushima Straits. And then shortly after he did that, he went into the second tour, the War College, where he helped co-develop the 70% ratio and the 88 fleet expansion plans that pretty much dogged the Japanese Navy to 1921 and beyond. But we have to look at him a little bit earlier to see his little known history. And these are just some little points here. He was #1 in his class. He spoke English years before he went to the Naval Academy in Japan. And #1 in most academy classes, most navies, indicates that you have some bright future. At the same time he graduated, and I didn't put this in full length, the intro in the first chapter of Mahan's Sea Power volume was published in the Japanese Naval Officer Association magazine. And the reason it was published this way is Kaneko Kontaro was a classmate of Theodore Roosevelt at Harvard. And he was visiting the United States in 1890 when Mahan's book came out. He left in May, just as the book came out, but he took it back with him to Japan and got them to publish it later that year. The whole issue of Mahan's first Sea Power volume is not going to be published. Is that me? Until 1896, years after Kaneko brings it back to Japan. If the name sounds familiar to you, it's because he's going to be the Japanese representative at Portsmouth after the defeat of Russia, along with another individual I'll talk about. He saw no action in the Sino-Japanese War because bad weather. After the war, he goes to torpedo school where he gets familiar with weapons and electric machinery. And then his next posting is quite unusual. Two things on this. The Japanese Navy is finding its sea legs on intelligence. And so he's dispatched as a local in Manchuria and Korea, which means he probably had some command of Mandarin and of Korean. And it's just a follow on from the Japanese army, which used what we call honeypots until 1904 when the war broke out. And they posed as photographers, they posed as laundrymen, as cook. In some cases, they actually seduced the wives of Russians stationed in that area. The Japanese Navy is maturing. In 1897, Akiyama is one of the first of the 5 to be sent abroad as a resident. And he leaves Japan in August. He stops in Hawaii. On the way to San Francisco, we see that the American newspapers can't spell his name right. The first of many problems that occur. If you're doing research and they don't spell the name right, or you're doing a digital research, you will find a problem. So my eyes went blind for a particular period of time because I had to find various keywords, search dates, read these newspapers, do all the stuff. He goes to Chicago, Washington as well. For those of you who are familiar with Robert Seeger's multi-volume Naval Institute proceedings volumes on Mahan doesn't get back to New York till after September 30th. So Akiyama is sitting in Washington, D.C., perhaps observing what's going on. And somebody slow me down if I'm going fast. I don't have a clock here. This next fellow is going to become important in several ways. Marsh is Rob Lee Fighting Bob Evans' son-in-law. For those of you who remember, he was the commander on the first half of the Round the World cruise until his gout got a hold of him in San Francisco. Prior to that, he's serving on the New York, which is a highly prized locale for, up and comers. He also works with the Office of Naval Intelligence, and I found that to be true going through the records, official and unofficial, where officers would have dual postings or ship off a ship and then come back to the ship. So of note, and this will become more important coming on, he will become the naval attaché and is there from 1901 to right after the war starts, actually a year later. And if you want to know how to end up as a dead-end job in history, he precedes Dudley Knox. Knox takes over from him, and this is how he ends his career. So if you're a historian, and I'm assuming all of you historians, if you get sent to the Office of Naval Records and Library, you may not be going much further. He retired as a captain. Now, again, looking at sources, and I want to apologize because for this, I'm one of those persons who likes to write in their books. And I make all kinds of notations. And this is from a book published in 1969. And the reason that's important is the general declassification of World War II records started in 1972. And let's just say they think they finished it by 95. I'm not sure doing that. This is a Japanese professor of literature, English and Japanese literature. And he borrowed something from Akiyama's book that I'll talk about later. But what's important is that the North Atlantic Squadron drilled to October 2nd. And if you look at the date of this, somehow or another, Akiyama made contact with a U.S. naval officer and got, if you've been to Washington, the Washington Army Navy Club is, kind of for the elites of the military. Another important thing about this is this, I don't know if anybody recognizes this name here. If you've heard of the very pistol This is Edward Very. He retired from the Navy as a lieutenant, quote unquote, because he could make more money selling arms and ammunition. And this is what, 15 years later, and he's still attached. And he got very, very wealthy, by the way, doing this. But again, if you hear anybody talking about a Very pistol, that's the guy who designed it. Now, why is this important? Well, because Akiyama finds his way into the center of the storm, so to speak. And if there's any other naval officers on here, this might be of interest to you. December 31st, 1897 is a Friday. And what do you think Washington, D.C. looks like on a Friday on New Year's Eve? I think everybody scatters out of town. What I can figure out from this is Akiyama hand wrote, and I got it from the archives, I hand wrote a 5-page personal letter to Roosevelt. It's a lot longer than this, of course. He talks about if I fail to advance, if I fail to get professional studies and qualifications, my career will be over. And for those of you who've been in the service, we were always told as junior officers, a way to impress a senior officer is to send them a letter of congratulations and do it in handwriting so it looks like you're really overwhelmed with your task, but that you took the time out to deliver a message of, hey, I wanted to let you know I did this. He's asking for the War College. Can't imagine anything better than this, but it gets slippery and somewhat dirty. This is the president of the Naval War College, Casper Goodrich. He had a long, good career. He is going to respond to the letter, and I said it was written on the 31st of December and delivered to Roosevelt's office. And Goodrich says no. A few days later, Goodrich says no emphatically. Then a few days later, in a different set of records, there was a reason for rejection from Roosevelt. And then on the 20th, and I aligned the date here and you'll see why, you can see that Akiyama gets what he wants, which is to get naval records. John Kuhn's volumes on the General Board talk about yellows. I used to call them canary copies for a long time. I don't know if any of you are old enough to remember when you type a letter and you put the carbon and then you put another piece in there to get the copy. In the yellows, in the Roosevelt papers at the Library of Congress, you can see a much fuller story. Roosevelt is asking Goodrich if we can share the information. Goodrich says no. There's a Roosevelt soups slip in here. Yakiyama. Can you imagine an assistant secretary, or what are they called today? Not. Anyway, can you imagine a Navy official calling somebody by the wrong name and expecting that? And then you can see this back and forth between Goodrich, Akiyama, and Roosevelt. And one letter is missing. I haven't found it. Akiyama said, we have the old stuff at the legation in DC. And Goodrich is fighting this. As you can tell, here's another indication of how things could get. Another one, can you imagine a government official saying, I wrote a pretty sharp letter to a Navy captain regarding this? And it's all quote unquote resolved because the previous assistant secretary, Roosevelt's predecessor, had been giving the reports away, and it was tied to Henry Taylor, who was then president of the college in 1895, who had decided to distribute them. It's important here to read the last sentence in that 24 January letter about security and confidential. This is from the abstract of 1897. I duplicated the image, and then the reason I put question mark is I found in the Japanese records. The abstracts for 1899, the abstracts for 1900, and the abstracts for 1901, including committee assignments, personnel, problems, and solution. Now, the Army Navy Journal of that era was publishing a lot of this stuff, but it's also possible that the level of information that the Japanese Navy got means somebody was revealing some information. So again, when somebody says this is secure, don't always believe that. But Akiyama's on a dual front. For those of you who don't recognize these guys, Hoshitoru had supported a strong military presence and aggressive action in Hawaii during the Second Hawaii Crisis in the summer of 1897, at the time that Akiyama was ordered to come to America, and the the North Atlantic Squadron commander was looking at a possible war with Spain and Japan. John Sherman is the reason Apple, Google, Amazon, all those companies may be broken up, because he was the author of the Sherman Antitrust Act of 1890. He's also the brother of William Tecumseh Sherman. Days his assistant, and then we have John Long thing. And as you can see here, diplomatic efforts. I want to point out something here, because most people do not pay attention to wording. Good offices. I remind you of the movie A Few Good Men, if you've seen it, where Tom Cruise and Jack Nicholson are talking about danger, serious danger, grave danger. Well, there's a certain level of the same process. Just like in diplomacy, serious consequences and grave consequences mean different things. Good offices is the expectation that you will use all of your power to try to get something done in a diplomatic forum. At this case, we have the Japanese minister writing the American Foreign Secretary of State. It's forwarded, it's refused. It's not the first time, it's not the last time. Akiyama finds his way to stay busy. I don't know if you can see the submarines themselves. Pictures are not always that great. The Argonaut is the top one, and the Plunger is the second one. They allow Akiyama to actually see the exterior and the interior of the Argonaut. He wants to see the interior of the Plunger, and they said no. Well, either they're worried about security considerations, but he continues later that month. He goes to Philadelphia to watch the launching of the HMIJS Kasagi, which was the first Japanese warship built in the United States. Beautiful looking ship. This is actually the Kasagi sitting off a Cramp shipyard right after Dewey has returned from Asia. And he's going to, the ship has got no guns, so it's heading to England, and a really large Japanese flag there. And as you can see, these are from newspapers. Stories get syndicated. So I found literally hundreds of stories about Akiyama in very small communities throughout the United States. So people knew who was here, whether they read the story or not. This visit to the Naval Academy, I've got to check to see if I can find any restrictions. But what caught my eye is, and I made the emphasis here, is so he said. And in modern parlance, when somebody uses that phrase, you're kind of questioning their veracity. The Spanish-American War breaks out. Akiyama is going to be finding his way in Tampa. This is Akiyama, and this is his army counterpart, Shiba, Major Shiba. They find their way down to Tampa. And when they get there, they introduce themselves to William Shafter, the commanding general of the American Army Forces down there. He's totally flummoxed. He doesn't know who they are, but the newspapers of the time all say Akiyama's going to Tampa. Again, reading is fundamental. In the Shafter papers in Stanford University, which are microfilmed to various places, and in the formerly classified adjunct general's office, Army General office, you're going to find a copy of the telegram, a variety of letters and discussions. The Secretary of the Army, a guy named Alger, says, no, 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 they're okay to go. As you can tell, there's no American among them. Shiba was Army, Akiyama, of course. There's Danish, there's French, I think there's Austrians and Germans in there. So it goes down to Tampa, and here's where the history gets kind of screwed up. He never joins the US Navy for the Spanish-American War. The history indicates that, hey, he did something with the Navy. No, he did not. He did not do anything with the Navy. However, I would call this a successful trek down to Cuba. If you can recognize this, this is a map that he drew for the Spanish-American War Battle of Santiago. And he is there for several months. He gets to observe the blockade of Santiago. He catches the details of Sampson, the commander of the American Naval Forces, using three-layered defense. He sees all this. He goes ashore, watches the US Army and Roosevelt in action. Then he goes back out to sea, and he's going out back to sea when his ship turns and starts to follow the New York, which is the last ship. And he then gets to interview Spanish survivors, checks battle damage. He returns to the United States. And for those of you who are familiar with the phrase, no comment, Akiyama was the only of the observers who did not remain silent. And then particularly New York papers, he does extensive comments praising Sampson, finding himself in the middle of the Sampson-Schley struggle that would go on. Basically, he says, Sampson was unlucky because he didn't get to participate in the battle, but he was the commander. He laid out the parameters of the planning, and the battle was successful. So therefore, he says Sampson was successful at all. Once ashore back at the legation in DC, he's going to write what's called a secret report, in which he talks about ship to shore, the amphibious thing, the blockade, and the battle, damage that the big guns did to the Spanish ships, and the mention of Fisk. This is something that is known later on. Fisk is the developer of the statometer and a rangefinder. The statometer is going to work well. Unfortunately, at Manila Bay and at Santiago, the rangefinders were deranged by big gun vibrations. In one case, it fell over, and we don't know all of those details. But Barr and Stroud, which is an English rangefinder company, found that out very quickly, and then eventually the details come out. So again, if you have Petey and Evans, or Evans and Petey's volume Kaigun, they talk about this secret report as the most important in the Japanese Navy because of his observations and his ability to detail down to what should be done and not should be done. This map is reproduced in Mark Petey's 1977 article on Akiyama. It comes out of that 1969 volume. It is the exact same picture. So he either knew Shimada or saw the book. I just go live. Diplomacy again. 6 months after the battle? We're going to see some important personages here who are going to help Akiyama. First of all, if you're familiar with the name Kumara Jotaro, he is the new American, Japanese representative in Washington, D.C. But if his name is familiar to you, it's because he will eventually join Kaneko. And he's in that famous picture in Portsmouth of 1905, standing next to Roosevelt on one side, and DeWitt and Rosen standing on the other side. And again, if you think back to that picture, the Japanese guys, this is one of them. Akiyama, he are going to grow very close. And in 1905, a few days after the Battle of Tsushima, the Japanese press reports that Akiyama will accompany Komuro to Portsmouth. Unfortunately, Akiyama's mother dies around that time, so he doesn't go. And they are good friends for the rest of their lives. Komuro dies in 1911, however. And as you can see here, Komuro writes a letter to the American Secretary of State, the new Secretary of State. And for those of you who don't know who John Hay is, he was President Lincoln's secretary, and he's Mr. Open Door. So lovely beard and mustache kind of thing. Unfortunately, Long gets the process wrong. And I put it here, Japanese Center for Asian Historical Records, short named JACAR. If you're interested in anything about the Japanese Navy, the Japanese Army, or the Japanese Foreign Ministry, I suggest you go to that, especially for those of you who like guns and ammunition reports and all that stuff. They have stuff from the Sino-Japanese War, the Russo-Japanese War, exercises, World War II. The latest data, or the latest date I found is 1966. So if you haven't discovered this route, a little caveat: not everything gets any translation. They have the famous pending, or translation, but they have little headers that tell you pretty much what's going on in there. And I can read a little bit of the Japanese, but it's in that archaic 1890s Japanese. Long gets the letter wrong from Komuro. Long thinks that Akiyama is asking for access to the Naval War College. Komuro asks for access to the North Atlantic Squadron. And if you're familiar with the Boolean loop, Long sends the response back, no, but if. We're not holding the class anyway this year, but if we were, we'd reconsider it. A week later, so to speak, Komuro reminds Hay that it was a request for access to the North Atlantic Squadron. And after some diddling back and forth, they get approval. And again, you have to go through various agencies. Here we're going through JAG and BUNAV, and also through the North Atlantic Squadron. So on February 4th, 1899, Akiyama gets permission to join the American North Atlantic Squadron. Now, the commander of the North Atlantic Squadron is a guy named Rear Admiral William T. Sampson. First of all, this picture is around the time of the Spanish-American War and thereafter. He started having a series of strokes in 1895. And we only know that because when he died in 1902, his wife filled out the pension report, and in Naval History, the Naval Institute Proceedings magazine, there's an article back in the 90s that what was wrong with Sampson. His widow filled out everything on the request for the pension, including all of his health problems and when they started, and then destroyed the physical health records. And a doctor and a historian went through that material. I know these little secrets that you find in faraway places. So here we have the Secretary of the Navy directing the Commander-in-Chief of the North Atlantic Squadron to take him aboard. I would say that's a pretty good directive here. For those of you who are not familiar, this is the New York. It's the armored cruiser. It was a sexy posting, and many officers will go through this when it's first commissioned, right up through the Spanish-American War and after. The fine folks at the National Archives were great help. I told them I'm looking for something, and they personally went and got the deck log for the New York and went through it. And they found only one item in this period of time I was looking for. And as you can see, they still can't spell Akiyama's name right. So I don't know, if your name is Smith and Jones, I don't think they misspell it. So Akiyama reports to the New York, which is anchored off of what was then called Tompkinsville. We call it Staten Island today. The whole fleet was off of Tompkinsville because they were scheduled to leave a couple of days later. But they sit around for a week because they have engineering problems. They have a variety of other things. And what you have is after what, 9 days, uh, Admiral Sampson writes a personal letter to Akiyama, report to Chadwick. We'll talk about him in a second. And for those of you who are service oriented, I found this to be a lot more common back then. Sampson wrote very respectfully. For those of you who are unfamiliar with this process, very respectfully is what a junior officer says to a senior officer, not the other way around. But I found this to be very common in that time frame. Chadwick was dual-hatted. He was not only the chief of staff for Sampson, but at times he served as CO because there was a rotation of duties around. And Chadwick is an important part of the American naval experience because he was the first attaché. He also brought back Kriegspiel back to the United States. He would later serve as the General Board, the War College. He dies in 1916. And I'm sorry, yes, 1916. But before he dies, he will meet with Akiyama again in the United States, and Akiyama is returning to Japan from the United States. They're both admirals at the time. But in the same letter, Sampson again tells Chadwick that he assigns them to Staunton, and Staunton is another important name in the U.S. Navy's history. He was going to be a war planner. He was involved in all kinds of canal investigation work, and he makes admiral as well, and the aforementioned Marsh. But here's the specifics of what he's supposed to be doing with them. For duty on the signal bridge as a signals and staff officer aide, and for such other duty as may be assigned to you. If you're going to be a signal aide, staff officer aide, that means you're going to be reading signal flags, looking at coding and decoding or any kind of interpretation. I can imagine that Akiyama with his skill set, and they said he had a photographic memory, is not going to forget this experience quite lightly. Now, there's two other names in connection with Akiyama, so to speak. Shipmates, we'll get to that point. A few months ago, I talked to John Kuhn after he appeared on the WNH series, and he told me he had written an article called Grudging Respect in 2016, in which he's looking at the US Navy interpretation and reading how the Japanese Navy did in the Sino-Japanese War. And in particular, he's going to talk about this guy, Frank Marble. Casper Goodrich is going to tear him a new one, saying, you don't know what you're doing. You're an ensign. You couldn't possibly know anything about naval history. Well, the fact was the Japanese were impressed by Marble's interpretation. And then he shows up at the New York in 1896, and the earliest record to the USS New York I found on Japanese records is 1896. He's there for 3 years. He's there when Akiyama shows up. And he then goes to Asia. We'll talk about that in a second. And importantly, he becomes the secretary to Dewey on the General Board for 3 years. And I've looked at the documents that crossed over his desk. And then he leaves the General Board and ends up replacing Marsh, who I mentioned earlier, as naval attaché. And he will reestablish his relationship with Akiyama to the point that he calls him my friend, my good friend. He's going on. They share information, contact, so to speak. Now, for those of you who are observant, here's 3 things you can make out of this picture. First of all, they're not underway. Why they're not underway? Marble is the officer of the deck in port. He's got the famous symbol on there. And this is the black armband, which pretty well dates it to about October 1901, when McKinley died from the assassin's bullets. By the way, he's the only one not mustached in there. So good old days. Another fellow attached to the New York at one time and then going to be friends with Akiyama in Japan is a guy named Irving Gillis. Now, if you're not familiar with that name, recommend a book by Bruce Swanson, the late Bruce Swanson, that was published by his wife after he died, called A Plain Sailorman in China. Half of it is about Gillis's naval career. The other half is about the acquisition of a massive collection while he lived in China. He died in China in 1947. Gillis was a source of frustration for Bill Braisted, if you're familiar with that name, because he could not talk about him in the U.S. Navy in the Pacific 1897 to 1909, because the Navy would not let him write about it. In between that 1958 publication and his second volume, 1909 to 1921, Braisted manages to get into Bethlehem Steel Records and finds out that Gillis, and he could publish it because it wasn't Navy records. Gillis had been working with the ONI, even as a retired naval officer, to help the Chinese build up a Navy. Gillis will also be in Tokyo in 1904 and 1905 as a transition between Marsh and Marble. And then he leaves Tokyo and becomes the naval attaché in Peking and Shanghai to help the Chinese build a Navy. And again, Bruce Swanson's book is fabulous. It just catches your eye when you recognize the name, so to speak. Now, I gave it a nautical title here. Problem for those of you who do research is finding out that you don't always get every report in the annual publications. And generally, the annual reports for the Navy, particular, and other Navy government branches are not published in the year they're about. They're published shortly after the new year starts. So for the USS New York or the Armored Cruiser New York, if you're looking for January 1st to December 31st, you're going to have to look at 2 volumes. However, Shimada covers that in his 1969 book and does a a good job, so to speak. And here's the schedule of activities: tic-tacs, squadron maneuvers, live fire, militia landing, and various parts. A number of port visits, and pay attention to one of the port visits because it's going to have one of those, degrees of separation. At the same time, the Army Navy Journal, if you have not read the journal, it spills the beans on officer orders, placements, commands, money. It was a great source of intelligence for foreign officers to read about the U.S. Navy. So the Naval War College session that was regularly scheduled is shut down because they don't have enough officers to do that. And a week later, there's general regret at this. Now, port visit. Found this picture. I didn't buy it. I found this picture on an auction site. So William T. Sampson and Jackie Fisher in Bermuda. That's the first port call they get. And on the first night in, they have what's called a dining out, which is where you have the officers and the men and the women, so to speak, all get together. And the first night ashore, Fisher's recollections of this is that he proposed a grand toast to Sampson and his victory at Santiago and all this. And then Sampson sat there mute, not knowing what to do or say. Then one of his staff aides came up and whispered into his ear, "Hey, boss, it's your turn." There's a fellow here. Vince and I were talking about this guy. Does anybody, I can't remember, does this look like Doyle, the Sherlock Holmes guy? If anybody knows, let me know. I think it's J.P. Morgan, because this yacht used to go through Bermuda. Again, I didn't buy the picture they wanted too much, but it's a good representation. Now, I have a little note down here. Some of you, what the hell is he talking about? This is tied to the potential fact, or the potential that the Japanese stole cryptography systems and also reverse engineered the Marconi. Shortly after this picture, Fisher's going to head to the Med. And after the Anglo-Japanese alliance is signed in 1902, the British and the Japanese make a agreement to exchange military information, naval information, signaling information. And so in mid 1902, a Japanese admiral sails to Malta. Fisher's under orders to hold back nothing, reveal as much. He lends him a courier for a radio. He lends him some mercury. The Japanese fleet takes it to England, and they said they're very happy with it. A problem that I've been finding is that, and those of you who speak Japanese might see this possibility, think about how you write Washington and Romanji, or the word Cuba or the word Cuba, how you spell them in Japanese. And the reason this book might be tied at some level to this kind of process is the Japanese slowly discovered that their English writing was not good. The system they cribbed required that you write your plain text in English and then in English sentences, and then convert it to a coding system. And at this point, the book itself has a little, it started in April of 1902, but it's published in 1903. And again, it's got that cute title. But I suspect there was maybe some connection to the fact that the Japanese Navy is eventually going to develop their own system and get rid of English. The Japanese Foreign Ministry will use English and this breakdown until the end of the war, the 1905 campaign, and do that. So whether he's connected or not, I'm still researching that aspect. At this point, the Army Navy General reports that Long has now ordered the North Atlantic Squadron to Newport for a shortened season. And if you look at the dates, the New York gets in, the North Atlantic Squadron gets into Newport on the May 29th, 1899. A couple of days later, we see the American, the Japanese representative, Kimura, requesting good offices. And after a short delay, and again, it goes through JAG and BUNAV, Akiyama is approved. And I talked to the former archivist, Evelyn Sherpak, and the new one, I don't know if Scott Riley, is he still there? They could locate the abstract, but no roster was located at all. The New York's deck log says Sampson and several officers, his staff and several officers went ashore. The question is, did Akiyama get ashore before he got official approval? I can't imagine leaving him alone on the New York while everybody goes ashore. And just as an experience here, the abstract lists a number of lectures and war games and strategic games on a number of dates. So he had permission to go ashore. He does that. And the lecture by McCullough, I believe was a captain by then, is going to reference Akiyama's 1898 comments on Sampson's victory. So as a perhaps ode to Akiyama being in company. This is a wonderful photo, so to speak, I found in the National Archives. A year after the Battle of Santiago, in Newport, on board the New York, and this is a quarterdeck, they're going to have a dining in. And again, that's no women. Dining out has women, a dining in has no women. For those of you who've ever been to either one, the port has been poured. The beef has not been paraded. The head table is probably, right here. Yep. Oh, sorry. And you can recognize a couple of things. First of all, a massive Japanese, German flag here, and a massive Japanese flag here. I only recognize 2 or 3 of the fellows in the photo. This is Chadwick here. I believe this is Clark of the Oregon. And these guys all look like Sigsbee and Crownshield, who are senior naval officers. The seating order doesn't seem to have any regularity. You got senior officers and junior officers mixed in. The senior officers, you can tell by their shoulder epaulets. The junior officers have the nothing on there. And the Army Navy general has this to say about this. So I'm assuming the head table includes Akiyama, and the guest, Mr. Henry Taylor, famous name in the Navy, is Mr. Vice. And again, if you're not familiar with dining in and dining out, I once had the joy of being Mr. Vice in Subic Bay, which would probably be a little bit different than Mr. Vice in Newport, Rhode Island. So Charles Sigsbee, navigation, Herbert Stockton, the president of Naval War College, guest, Stephen Luce, retired admiral, and William McCarty Little, Mr. War Planning and War Games. And the local newspapers around that time all have his name spelt right for Akiyama and his position. And I put these lower 3 down here to show how it took over a year to learn how to get his name right. So when you're doing research, particularly digital research, and you put in those keywords, remember, particularly in Western languages, you're bound to get variations. I found 7 of them so far, which means there's certainly much more going on. These 2 folks are going to be pivotal in Akiyama's career as well. In 1899, E.D. Kenji came over as a new resident. Akiyama was only supposed to be here for 2 years, but he had the chance of being in the Spanish-American War. He was on New York. He got onto the War College, so he was extended by a year. When he gets here, he makes a report back to Japan that Akiyama's permission has been rescinded in July. Concern about foreigners, but the different sources I have in Japanese also agree with American English sources, because the War College, last War College class was on the 28th, and then on the 29th, there's no need to be on board doing anything. Edie is going to be a source of interest because in JCAR, there's a ton of his reports. And what I could tell from that is either Akiyama was not as busy as he appeared to be, or he was too busy and he stashed his reporting at the legation, because Edie will forward a number of topics, including electricity, mechanical, weapons, all kinds of things like that. And the next fellow here is the acting president of the Naval Staff College, the Japanese equivalent of the War College. And he's returning from the Hague Conference where he met Mahan. He was not impressed by Mahan. He gets to America. He's going to leave through Vancouver, but he's going to stop in the United States on the way back. And a little bit over a month, over a month that Akiyama left, you get this presentation, Army Navy Journal. And again, I'm going to have to find what credentials they're talking about. Sakamoto was quite impressed with Akiyama, and so impressed that when he became the president of the Staff College, that the full president, not the acting president, in the summer of 1902, he designates Akiyama to become the War College, Staff College instructor for strategy, tactics, and logistics. Akiyama's first tour at the Japanese Naval Staff College is from November of 1902 to December of 1903. And Togo will eventually recognize his skill and things like this. Now, diplomacy again, yes, I know. You're all expecting bombs and guns and stuff like that. No, sometimes the dirty work has to be done. Kimura writes, and look at the dates. Hey, you helped Akiyama get into the North Atlantic Squadron. Many, many thanks for you. Look at the second day. Hey, you helped Akiyama get into the Naval War College. Thank you, thank you, thank you. However, the father of the Japanese Navy also gets involved. This is a 8-page document. It started in September, gets sent out in October, in which the naval minister, the elder Yamamoto, not the one that was involved in Pearl Harbor, everybody gets confused, is going to put together a multi-page document. And for those of you who can read Japanese, you can catch Akiyama's name in here and the Secretary of the Navy, the North Atlantic Squadron. But look at the names that are on the distribution. Secretary of the Navy Long, Admiral Sampson, Chief of Bureau of Navigation, and Captain Chadwick, Sidney Staunton. So when you get a foreign letter, and this is in JCAR, not in the American documents, it's in JCAR. Now, Akiyama's not done. Reason, and you can thank Vince for this. Vince had asked me a question, and I got intrigued, and I decided to check on it. And the experiments that Marconi was doing in 1895, 1896, eventually got the Americans' attention, and the New York Tribune hired him to come to America to cover the world, the America's Cup races. And so Akiyama is observing this, and look at his language. Yes, we're interested. Even more so, in the second one, he talks about, I'm here to study all kinds of electrical matters. And again, these are an obscure publication, particularly Electrical World Engineer. He's also here when the United States Navy hires Marconi to do field tests on the New York and Massachusetts. And they report that the range on Marconi's radio is in excess of 35 miles at sea. So again, and this is in public documents, so he knows what's going on. Now, I put this little note down here, Return to Japan. There was a little interlude. He went to Europe for 6 months in January to meet up with all the other residents, where he meets Marconi again. But in that absence, when he went to Europe, he visited Russia, Italy, Germany, Britain, France, and Romania to look at their, I didn't know Romania had a navy, so to speak, to look at their naval aspects and things like this. His return home, the Japanese route him through Canada and the CP, the Canadian Pacific Railroad, because the Royal Navy has just opened the naval base at Esquimalt. I don't know if anybody has been there. I've been there before, and I got to tell you, they do roll up the sidewalks at 5 o'clock. If you go to that town, it's pretty ordered, so to speak. So important questions I had, and you can see that at top. Akiyama didn't become the genius by coming to America. I think that his skill set was enhanced by what he observed in the United States. And nothing speaks loudly to that aspect, particularly with this newspaper in Washington, D.C. And look at the date, one day after the Battle of Tsushima Straits. Somebody in the Navy either talked to the press or, they figured out what was going on. Akiyama was not a static participant while he was here. And a year later, so to speak, while Marble is his friend in Tokyo, we get this reporting. And it's not unique, however, to the US Navy. In about 1905, 1906, navies in Europe and around the world started to realize they need to tighten up their security because too many people were observing what was going on. So did he learn too much? Did he learn enough? I say he learned what he needed to learn and ran with it, so to speak. Now, is Carl here? I don't know if Carl's on there. Carl, this is, if you're there, this is a reference to February, since we're supposed to be talking about the 100th anniversary of the Washington Conference. Hato and Akiyama are intimately involved with that. This is about October 1905, when the Grand Fleet's being disestablished and then been turned into the Standing Fleet. From there, Akiyama will go to his second tour at the War College, where he'll help co-develop the 70% fleet plan and the 8-8 concept. The guy next to him is the elder Kato, and Kato will be the one who drives the stake at Washington into both the 8-8 and 70% fleet prospect. The only one who survived past World War II is Funakashi. He dies in 1962. They all make admiral. I believe they all make vice admiral at a minimum. But again, just a little salute to what may be coming forth next year. And I don't know if I took too much time, but how do I punch out?
Okay, you're done, Carlos. Is that correct?
Yeah, I thank you for your attention. And if you have questions or sharp criticisms, because I need them for that kind of prospect, I want to be able to do that. So do I stop sharing?
Yeah, why don't you go ahead and stop sharing? Perfecto. And we'll go ahead and open the floor to any questions that people may have about this presentation. And I think I'm going to take advantage of my position, and I'll turn it over to Bud after I ask just one quick question here. It's not clear to me, Carlos,
Yeah.
why were people like Roosevelt and Sampson so eager to help this guy? I mean, why? What was he just attractive? Was he charming? Was there some sort of political?
Two things I had mentioned about the personal letter, and you know, when I was a young officer starting out, senior officer says, you know, how to impress the old folks by writing this letter. I'm too busy. But the other thing, and I think it seems like coming through, is perhaps there was a sense of hubris on the U.S. Navy side. I mean, clearly they knew he was here, but sometimes maybe it's racism. What could he learn? You know, he's Japanese. He doesn't know what's going on. That aspect. I have not found anything that would say specifically, oh, let's give him everything and not worry about the consequences. I think in the normality of events, Roosevelt and everybody else seem to want to play the game. You know, this is how we're superior Western folks, where the Japanese were looking at it as, what can we learn from these guys?
Yeah, I think the next question was Bud, and then I think it's Sam after that.
Yeah, Carlos, a great presentation. In response to Vince's question, I think Roosevelt's interest in Japan started as early as the earlier mid 1890s. And so that may have influenced us. But my question is, interesting that Akiyama spoke English so early in the relationship. How common was that?
His brother, I'm not sure you're familiar with his brother was the famous general in the Japanese army himself, and horses and all this, and becomes a very senior general. But he advised his brother, Akiyama Saneyuki himself, to learn another language, to become more cosmopolitan, so that he can get into the Naval Academy, since they went everywhere around the world. And he started learning English in 1884. By chance, his first two deployments were to England. So works out pretty good. I also pointed out since he was dispatched as a local in Manchuria and China, I would say he was multilingual. And you know that old joke, what do you call a person that speaks three languages? Trilingual. What do you call a person that speaks two languages? Bilingual. What do you call a person who speaks one language? American.
Well, just to follow up quickly, also, I wonder if that was tied to Japan's invitation to the Royal Navy to they use the German army as a model for the modern army, and the Royal Navy as a model for the modern Navy and so forth. So
it may be because of the first group of 5 that were dispatched. Akiyama came to America. One was sent to Britain. Another one was sent to Germany. Another one was sent to Russia. I can't remember what the 4th one was. And then they replicated in 1899 again. The resident program was designed to actually be useful to learn information. You know what they say, a little learning, it can be a dangerous thing. And relationships between people and groups, you tend not to want to be seen as rude or, oh my gosh, you violated my rights. So Akiyama came at a time where it seemed like it was very possible. One thing I do want to note, Ide actually asked for permission to join the North Atlantic Squadron after Akiyama left, and the Navy said, "Niet, we're not going to have you go on there." So perhaps the perception was, hey, we made a mistake.
I think the next question is Sam.
Hi, Carlos. That's
Hey,
a
Sam.
good presentation. And I like your T-shirt, the Sea People's Mediterranean Tour. Of course, Velikovsky said that they actually came later than most historians think. Couple of points I'd like to make, and then I'd like to push you to sharpen your thesis a bit.
Okay.
The permission of foreign officers to follow along other militaries seem to have been considered a professional courtesy. You have those officers at the Battle of Gettysburg with Lee, and probably on the Union side. So maybe to determine whether Akiyama had a unique type of relationship or unique ability to unique ability to gather information, you probably need to look at whether the U.S. allowed other officers of other nations the same sort of access. I kind of suspect that they did until the ONI was established and started thinking, oh, we need counter intelligence efforts and stuff. But up till then, it seems like foreign officers got amazing knowledge of, if you recall in the book The Killer Angels, novel, of course, about Gettysburg, you have Longstreet talking with the British officer, and then Shea, the author, has Longstreet thinking, why am I telling this guy? We may have to fight him someday. So I think it was a courtesy, but I think some people were cognizant that maybe it was gone too far. But I would like to sharpen your thesis a little bit, and to say, what is your conclusion? What do you think? Do you think that Akiyama's knowledge that he gained actually helped the Japanese in the Russo-Japanese War, or was it inconsequential? Was there anything that you see that may have changed? I mean, he was studying signals on board the New York. Do you have any evidence, or is it possible to get any evidence that the Japanese Navy changed in any way because of his activities? Thanks.
The late Sadao Asada's book on that was translated into English, he has a wonderful observation about Akiyama learning new materials. And I'm not arguing that Akiyama became a genius because he was in the United States. When you have his set of skills and you have his mindset, I think a little information can go a long way. And so the point is not that he left the United States. I'm ready to beat the Russians in the war and play all this thing, but I think we see the development, the professional development of individuals. And in the 1890s, the progressive era, you do see that progressive professionalism going along the way. And what I'm looking at is not particular that he became super smart, but that he took information from all sources. And one of the Japanese, and John, I don't know if you've read any of these. In one of the Japanese volumes, they talk about him like Napoleon. Akiyama later developed what would be called today ADHD. He became more like a John Boyd, if you're familiar with him, you know, the guy they called Genghis John. He didn't sleep that much. He'd fall asleep for 10 minutes. Oh, I've got an idea. He'd go into a dream state. He'd take his shoes off at a table and peel the skin off his toes. He'd eat sloppily. And one story, he walks out of the wardroom, decides to jump into the water with his full uniform on, and then come back and he's refreshed. In this reading, they're talking about he had a compartment. Oh my gosh, I'm struggling over there. His mind was like a library catalog. He had information that he could draw upon and pull upon. And oh, I see a problem, I can go here. And I think when I made the reference to John Boyd, only thing that Akiyama may not have had was a 358-page slide program. You can spend 4 or 5 days looking at this, but he was quite unique in a skill set. So I don't know if that answers your question particularly.
Well, I just wanted to, my real question is, did anything he find out improve the Japanese Navy? I mean, is there any evidence that you could point to and say, because of Akiyama's information, the Japanese improved their signals, or they about this technique?
When he went to his first tour at the War College in late 1902, he introduces new gaming concepts and tabletop map exercises and strategic games that he observed. And so he had not seen the games in Britain. He had not seen the games in Europe at all. And like I said, when Sakamoto got here in 1899, he was impressed with the ability of Akiyama to get things done and to observe and see details and things like this. The problem is that I'm looking through JCAR particularly, I can't find but a single reference to Akiyama in the period he was here, other than that Yamamoto thank you note. But clearly he was a busy guy, and maybe he didn't write it down the way we would like to find it. And John will agree with this. One of the problems of that era is they don't footnote their materials. So you're reading Japanese materials and they don't say it's in this volume or that. So I think the Japanese started footnoting after 1970. I don't know if you're familiar with that. Yeah, so.
Okay, we have more questions here.
John, remember I emailed you earlier about the Section 3 of the Japanese Navy?
Sorry, that's completely.
The intel branch. Remember?
I'm not.
Oh, okay. It. Yeah, the third bureau. Yeah, it sounds like a Star Wars, Star Trek thing. I was able to pin down the first director was appointed in December of 1897. So it wasn't that long ago in relative terms to Akiyama in there, but
interesting. Okay.
Could you mention how Akiyama's career ended up? You said he became a vice admiral.
He did. He did after he left the Grand Fleet in 1905. He did a second tour. Excuse me, was my voice. At the Naval Staff College with Sato, where they developed the 70% plan and then the 8-8 fleet plan. Then he went back out to sea and he promoted up his way, but he started to have problems towards the last third of his career. apparently he was more interested in China and phosphates in the South Seas, to the point that by 1916, the Japanese Navy decided to remove him from his position and send him to Europe to observe the war in Romania and Italy. He goes to Britain to talk to him about Jutland. He visits America and talks to Chadwick about Jutland. He returns to Japan and is made the commander of a torpedo squadron, which is effectively a demotion. He decides to hang it up at the end of 1917, and then they give him that you live long enough to become a vice admiral. And then in December he retires, and then in February 1918 he dies at age 50. So the last third was kind of, yeah, Hal, or
It sounds like he had dementia.
Yeah, I was gonna say, it sounded like there's some unaddressed mental health issues here of some sort.
there might be, and I don't know. Sato and Akiyama will kind of split. Akiyama starts seeing Bushido spirit as an important. They split over that 70% program ratio. Akiyama says we have a better than 50-50 chance of winning an engagement with the United States, and Sato says no, you have no better. But Akiyama are, oh, the Bushido spirit, the spirit of warfare, and at this point they're starting to split over this process. Sato never was interested in China. He said the South Seas for Japan was the most important thing, but Akiyama started to look at China as an opportunity as well. When you mention, what do you call it, dementia? His only combat experience personally was the Russo-Japanese War. And I don't know if seeing death and destruction, I mean, the Japanese Navy really laid it on to the Russian Navy, and Togo sent him over to accept the final surrender, and he's passing over dead bodies and stuff. So it may do that, but also, as I mentioned, he's like a John Boyd, so maybe a connection with that and process of, hey, my meds need to be adjusted to make me a more, professional member, so to speak.
So what did he do during the war, the Russo-Japanese War?
He Togo selected him as a staff officer, and he didn't become the chief of staff. He became the most important staff officer. Kato and Togo exercise what's called as control by negation. As long as they liked your idea, they would use it. And they would tell Akiyama no every once in a while, but they mainly used his planning for this process, to the detriment of other staff officers, so to speak.
So in other words, he had a very large role.
He did, but again, if somebody has to believe in you and believe in your plan.
You can't quantify it as well as you would like to quantify it.
Yeah. All I know is, for those of you who have Petey's and Evans and Petey's volume, the chapter on Akiyama, I don't know if you remember that, John. What's it called?
Can't
Learning
remember the
to,
name of the chapter off the top of my head.
yeah, learning to fight.
Oh, mhm.
Yeah. So
Well, if there are no other questions, I will probably go ahead and wrap it up, unless there's any last comments you would like to make, Carlos, or anything you
Hal?
would like to say.
Yeah, is this Carlos? Are you working on an article or a book or?
yeah, I was looking at the idea of 3 separate monographs on each of the decades for Akiyama, and I spent a lot of time on the second set of years, but I thought looking at the first years, and then I know what happens in the third part. So, and not a full-blown biography, because it's been 9 years since some of you know I had a stroke in 2012, and I had been working with Japanese stuff at that point, but after that I haven't really. Thank God I wrote down notes and translations, but
Yeah,
to get there. So
good luck with it.
Well, you're kind of an inspiration to us in some respects, Carlos. I've known Carlos for a good number
11
of
years.
11 years, whatever it's been. And I have to say, Carlos, you've come back very well. I was very worried about you at one point, but it's nice to see you walking miles and miles and miles every day.
Does everybody know that the fire control group thought I was a lawyer and I got drunk in the bar? If you look at the name Carlos R. Rivera in any phone book, well, Carlos Rivera, you'll find hundreds in certain cities. I used to have an unlisted phone number in Santiago, Coronado, because if you live close to Mexico, Carlos Rivera is possibly on everybody's birth certificate crossing the border. So
we were at Carlos and I met 25 years ago. We were at a conference, I think it was the OAH, and I called the hotel desk to connect to Carlos's room, and this guy with a really thick Mexican accent answers. And I knew Carlos was raised in, Portland, I think, or something like that. And so later on, I see Carlos and I say, what is going on? He said, oh, Carlos Rivera is like John Smith in Mexico. You got to use my middle initial to get the right Carlos Rivera.
You mentioned something. For those of you, if you remember the name Marble, the guy who was the naval attaché at the end of the Russo-Japanese War, I once had the experience, and I don't know if you were there, Hal. Were you on a panel with Malcolm Muir?
It might have been.
Back in the 90s. And you submit your papers months in advance. And I chose Frank Marble. Unfortunately, that was just after, do you remember Jeremy Bourda? Does that name ring a bell? The CNO who committed suicide at the Naval Yard. Well, it was bad timing because Marble committed suicide in 1911, and I had to do a lot of dancing. He ended up shooting himself at the Naval War College. So I had to do a lot of dancing to say, no, this is not about naval officer, it was just the timing. So Muir was laughing at hilariously because he knew I had submitted it months earlier. So timing is everything. But anyway, I thank everybody for their attention and their questions, and appreciate it. Vince?
Well, thank you very much, Carlos. I will say that we're going to take a short break on the Q&A, so it'll probably be several months before we have the next program. So, but we will continue as into the next year. And thank you very much, Carlos.
Okay.
This has been an excellent, very interesting presentation, like I expected. And I thank you for your time and attention, everybody.
All right, everybody be well.
Hal?